Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the Council, I don't know how many of you come to our events on a regular basis, but I really like this seating and the round seating so much more. I think it's just a much better way to be theatrical, and I hope everyone today in today's panels will try to follow that instruction. On behalf of the Council, I'd like to welcome you to the launch of Tallinn Manual 2.0 on the international law applicable to cyber operations. To those of you watching online, I encourage you to join the discussion by following @ AC Scowcroft, @ CCDCOE, and using hashtag Tallinn Manual. And for the uninitiated of the world, it's Tallinn with 2 N's and 2 L's, Tallinn Manual. So hashtag Tallinn Manual. It is the Atlantic Council's central mission to meet global challenges and navigate political and economic change by engaging the transatlantic community and our allies around the world. And our feeling isn't just it's our duty to do that, it's the outcome if we don't do that in this defining moment of history will be chaos or less benevolent actors filling the void. And more challenging global times require, in our view, even deeper engagement with our friends and allies, so we're committed to that. We're therefore honored to join forces with the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence and the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States, and it's just an honor to have the ambassador here today to host this timely conversation. We intentionally called our cyber operation at the Atlantic Council the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, because we thought that a lot of the statecraft of this area of the world, who's responsible for what? What do you do if there's an Article 5 violation? What part of the international governments will actually adjudicate when there's a conflict? All of these incredible questions just aren't sufficiently handled. I'm also delighted that the founding director of this statecraft initiative, now at Columbia University, Jay Healy, is here as well. The Tallinn Manual is the most comprehensive and truly global analysis of how existing international law applies to cyberspace, cyber statecraft. In 2013, the NATO Center published the first Tallinn Manual, which was focused on international law implications related to cyber operations that justified the use of force or occurred during armed conflict. The Atlantic Council hosted the launch of the first manual 4 years ago, and we're delighted to welcome this sold-out house, this full house, for 2.0. Since 2013, with the introduction of groundbreaking new technological developments such as the Internet of Things, our society's dependence on connected technologies has increased. As a result, we've noticed a notable uptick in disruptions to these technologies and disruptions of the societal institutions they underpin, and this will only accelerate. Here at the Atlantic Council, this growing dependency and its implication for not only national security but also public safety and global economic stability has emerged as the central focus area of our Cyber Statecraft Initiative. The Tallinn Manual 2.0 expands upon the original to add critical analysis of international law to cyber operations occurring during peacetime, as in the recent Democratic National Committee hack. In a moment, Liis Vihul, the project manager of the Tallinn Manual from the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, will explain the process and the contents of the second manual in more detail after some opening remarks, and I'll get to that in a second. We'll then move to the panel discussion examining the broader implications and application of the manual. But before Liis takes the stage, I want to extend a special welcome to our distinguished guests joining me in opening this event. Ambassador Hennis Shur is the ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States and a noted expert on cybersecurity collaboration between businesses and governments. Ambassador, it's great to have you with us. Sven Sakov is the director of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And it's wonderful to have you here, Sven. He previously served in various senior positions in the Estonian Ministry of Defense. Please also join me in welcoming our panelists. Professor Michael Schmidt is the director of the Tallinn Manual process. He brings several years of experience as the chairman of the International Law Department at the United States Naval War College and the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Megan Stiefel is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative and founder of Silicon Harbor Consultants. She previously served as an attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice and Director for International Cyber Policy in the National Security Council at the White House. Great to have you with us, Megan. Rutger van Marising is Senior Policy Officer at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working on international security issues in the cyber domain, including the Hague process consultations on the Tallinn Manual 2.0, so a really powerful group of panelists. And then lastly, someone I've already introduced briefly, Jason Healy, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Columbia University, one of the leading experts on cyber conflict and security, and the former director, as I said previously, of our Cyber Statecraft Initiative. So I look forward to a lively and engaging discussion, and now I'd like to welcome Sven to the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Fred, and for the opening remarks, and good afternoon also from my side. It's sure very good to be in tropical Washington, D.C. When I left Tallinn with two N's, as very cleverly noted, and the city which has a manual, it was 0 degrees there, and I mean Fahrenheit, so it is a bit of a change for me. I first like to thank the Atlantic Council for the support provided, the meticulous organizational effort by the staff, especially Aini, who is leaving the room, as I mentioned her name. They also special thanks go to the Dutch MFA and ambassador here for their support through the Hague process, what you're going to hear soon more about. And also the Estonian Embassy and the Baker & McKinsey law firm for our support during the launch. The main bunch of support, of course, goes to office, to the IGE, the International Group of Experts, and to the leading engines of this work, Mike Schmidt and Liis Vihul, whom we're going to see very soon here at the stage. Since I have a podium, I'm not going to go away without actually telling you some things about the CCDCOE, because very often people do not know too much about what we do. Clearly, you know that we are involved in a Tallinn Manual issue, but this is not the only thing what we do. We are not just a organization dealing with legal matters. So what we are a small international organization. We belong to our nations. Despite the name, we are not part of NATO, and we are not speaking on behalf of NATO, so please keep that in mind. What we are a research institution, a knowledge hub, a training facility and exercise facility. And we do basically 3 types of things. We do applied research, we train, and we exercise. We organize exercises. So if you are, and we do those 3 types of activities in 4 focus areas, what we are having: technology, strategy, operations, and law. So if you are a techie, you might know us probably, or you will probably know us for a lock shields exercise. You see that on a roll-up here, which is, to the best of our knowledge, biggest and most complex international live-fire, red-on-blue technical cyber defense exercise. Last year we had more than 700 people participating, 20 national teams trying to stay alive at the hands of a red team, which was, of course, very formidable. If you From a military, you might know us for the work we do on developing the NATO cyberspace operations doctrine, or the support what we provide for NATO in the exercise planning. Many people know us for the CCDCOE conference, what is an annual conference held in the summer in Tallinn when the sun is up pretty much all the time. It's, I think, either that or the generous booze what we provide is a very popular event. And the news is that last October we had the pilot CCDCOE also in US in cooperation with the US Army Institute of Cyber. So basically we were helping them to organize CCDCOE in US. That took place in DC in October. And the next one going to be in Washington, DC, if you want to mark into your calendar on the 7th of November this year, meaning 100th anniversary of a Bolshevik revolution, precisely. There's no connection there. And of course, when you're a lawyer, then you probably know us because of the Tallinn Manual. I guess that actually there might be lawyers in the world who know Estonia because they looked up what does Tallinn mean, because they know that there is a manual. Fred already kind of said on how the scope of the Tallinn Manual has expanded from 1.0 to 2.0. In a very simple terms, really, I can wrap it up in a way that when the first one was looking at war, then now it's looking at both war and peacetime regimes. In other words, we have gone full Tolstoy, war and peace now, with this manual. Without further ado, I will shut up now and give the floor over to the ambassador from the Netherlands. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Hennis Schuur. I'm the ambassador of the Netherlands. Very happy and proud to be here. Thank you, Fred, for your kind words. I hope my office noted that I am a cyber expert. Some people in the office think that I'm stuck in the time of Tetris. That is now officially debunked by the head of the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for coming. I think that the reason why you might also be here is that this conference, this seminar takes place at an important point in time. I can just compliment you on your sense of timing to have this conference now. I have to almost assume that the arm of the Atlantic Council reaches all the way from Washington into the Kremlin to make all those extra things possible to make sure that you are here. This is an important point of time. And it reminds me a little bit about the importance of internet. Internet has been compared to the invention of the printing press. What we have experienced with internet, I think, is phenomenal. And I think that if you look at the printing press, you also see immediately the danger. Nobody has experienced that more than us in Europe. The printing press brought about an enormous wave of possibilities resulting in the Renaissance, but also brought about an enormous wave of instability resulting, among others, in the schism of the Catholic Church. And you can see that there is all kinds of possibility opening also with the internet. The internet is a force for good and can be a force for evil. And I think we have to learn from the history, and we have to all band together to make sure that this internet, this cyberspace that opens for us all, will be a force for good, a force for peace, and a peaceful movement around the world of which we all benefit. And I think in doing so, we have to realize that not everybody around us or everybody in the world might share that same goal. Therefore, it's very important that we are here. It's very important, that's why I'm so happy, to be part of the launch, to celebrate the launch of Tallinn 2.0. We in the Netherlands always have placed a high value on an open, accessible, secure and peaceful cyberspace. And we have already from the beginning, some of you might remember, we started the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and we did there the thing that we are good at in the Netherlands. We brought together people from academia, people from the government, people from company to basically talk to each other and exchange knowledge and expertise on a global level. This is the next step. The Tallinn Manual 2.0, which also is called officially on the international law, applicable to cyber operations, is the next level on that path. Not for nothing, we are involved. I think we pride ourselves in the Netherlands that The Hague is the UN capital of international justice. That is part of our input in this process. Through the Hague process, we have tried to bring together the people who were the authors of this new manual with state actors, people, representatives of governments to say, you know what, you have to work together to manage this beast that we have unleashed and to make sure that there is a manual. Because we think it's the responsible of the international community to ensure that peace and security and stability are maintained in accordance with international law. And that's why we need a manual like this. We also are very happy that we are here with people from NATO, with people from the real Tallinn. We are happy that NATO has recognized that cybersecurity is in the operational domain. We have a responsibility there, and we have to, all of us, although it's not a neighbor of a NATO institution, through Tallinn, we have to share the expertise that we have in cyber defense through the NATO Center of Excellence. I hope that we have, and I think we have contributed through the Hague process to further the cause of this Tallinn Manual. We believe in bringing together people from academia and people from the government to take the next step, because the next step will be very, very necessary. The application of international law to state conduct in the digital domain is for us a bedrock of international peace. This is the next frontier that we all have to conquer. And I think that the Tallinn Manual is basically our guide for the next frontier. I don't know, I forget the name, but there was this wonderful book about the guides if you travel through outer space, sort of a science fiction kind of book. This is it. This should be it. If you travel through cyberspace, if you try to be part of that next journey that I think the whole world is undertaking, I think the Tallinn Manual should be your travel guide. And therefore, I'm very happy to be able to help launch this very important work. Thank you very much.
Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just see if this works. Works. Well, I can't begin to express, and I can't express this strongly enough, how excited we are at the CCDCOE to be launching the Tallinn Manual 2.0 here in Washington, D.C., together with the Atlantic Council, that we're back here at the Atlantic Council again, and together with the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. For us at the CCDCOE, this marks an end to a very long journey, and we're happy to have so many of you here in person, as well as via the internet, celebrate with us. What I'd like to do during the next couple of minutes is to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the Tallinn Manual, why it was written and for whom it is meant, and what it is about. And when we look at the genesis, we actually have to go back in time an unbelievable 10 years already. We have to look at what happened in Estonia in 2007, as well as the cyber operations that occurred in the armed conflict between Russia and Georgia in 2008. Not only were those cyber operations a realization for the international community that a new national security threat has emerged, but moreover, those cyber incidents made legal advisors in states, as well as policy folks, ask whether what happened against Estonia and what happened in cyberspace in the Russian-Georgian war, whether those cyber operations were acceptable as a matter of international law, or whether this is something that the international community should not tolerate and should regard as unlawful. And to answer those questions, what we did at the NATO CCDCOE was that we convened a group of international law practitioners and scholars. There were about 20 of them, and we asked them to start answering those questions. And although the Tallinn Manual has become kind of famous, you might not know that it falls into a long-standing tradition of producing international law manuals about how international law regulates various types of state conduct in various contexts. You can see that this tradition goes back to the late 19th century, and in the last couple of decades, a couple of manuals have been produced that look at various state activities on the seas, in the air, as well as there's an upcoming manual that looks at state activities in outer space. So the Tallinn Manual nicely falls into this fairly long-standing tradition of producing international law manuals. Now, the first Tallinn Manual, as was mentioned, was published in 2013. As was also mentioned, this book did look at the so-called high-risk, low-probability events. In other words, those that are most critical from a national security perspective. So the first Tallinn Manual was helpful for states in assessing the legality or unlawfulness of the Stuxnet-type cyber operations, the Saudi Aramco-type incidents, as well as those cyber operations that occur in the context of kinetic hostilities. However, while we were writing the first Tallinn Manual, we were acutely aware of the fact that even though those types of incidents are the most critical from a national security perspective, states on a day-to-day basis are not grappling with these types of issues, but rather those that fall below the threshold that do not entitle states to, for instance, exercise the right of self-defense. And so even before we published the first manual in 2013, we actually embarked on this somewhat longer journey to look at the peacetime international law that regulates the below-the-threshold cyber operations. And this is what we are celebrating here today, the Tallinn Manual 2.0. This includes both the peacetime law analysis that we produced since 2013, as well as the analysis from the first Tallinn Manual. It has been reprinted in this book, which is part of the reason why it's so big. We did not write all of this in the past 3-4 years. And so with regard to this country here, the second Tallinn Manual is helpful in looking at the lawfulness or unlawfulness of all of those incidents that you can see on the screen, the Sony-type incidents, those targeting OPM, the DNC hack, as well as the cyber operations against Stein. All of those are so-called below the threshold for which Tallinn Manual 2.0 should be helpful. All right, and a couple of words about the process. Both of those manuals were written by a so-called international group of experts. Both groups were led by Professor Mike Schmidt, and I can actually see a couple of other members of the international group of experts here in the audience. We have Professor Eric Jensen from BYU. We have Andrei Kozik, an international law scholar from Belarus. We have Gary Brown, formerly US Cyber Command, today Marine Corps University. But with regard to the second Tallinn Manual, not all of those experts came from the Euro-Atlantic area. In fact, we also had international law scholars from China, from Japan, from Thailand. So this really is a reflection of international law as it applies globally. All of those experts who comprised the international group of experts participated in this project in their private capacity. This means that this book really is an academic product. It is not reflective of NATO policy or NATO doctrine, and neither is it meant for negotiations. It's not a negotiating document that is ultimately designed to end up in an international treaty. But really, it's meant for primarily state legal advisors to assist them in thinking through the legal issues that arise when either their states are planning to engage in certain types of cyber operations, or when their states are taking hits from abroad, and to assess what the international law implications in these situations are. What the whole exercise is about is that the manual looks at the pre-cyber international law, those treaties that do not mention cyber anywhere, and applies and interprets that pre-cyber international law in the cyber context. So it was a big interpretive exercise. The way the book is set up is that it consists today of 154 black letter rules. Those black letter rules reflect consensus among those experts in the international group. And then each of those rules is accompanied by a fairly extensive commentary, which then explains what the rule means, as well as lays out any differences of opinion among those experts. And I can tell you there were differences of opinion almost always. The whole process that happened within the international group of experts was further supported by a fairly rigorous peer review. We had more than 50 peer reviewers, international law scholars and practitioners from all over the world. And in addition to this academic non-binding peer review, we also got very useful input from states within the realm of the Hague process, which was co-launched and co-hosted by the CCDCOE and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And these are the contents of the manual. The takeaway of this is that, as you see, there is so much international law that applies to state cyber operations, as well as, to an extent, cyber operations undertaken by non-state actors. And we can see that really cyber operations do not occur in a legal vacuum. There is a robust body of international law that regulates those cyber activities, and in the manual we look at how they do so. And with that, I will wrap it up, and I'm happy to give the floor over to the panel and let you soon engage in some of Q&A as well. Thank you.
Sorry. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Atlantic Council. It's really great seeing so many people that have been with the Cyber Statecraft Initiative and the Atlantic Council for so many years. It's great to see you back. If this is your first time here, really welcome, and I think this is really going to set us off, and you'll see why the Atlantic Council has been a place to come and hear what's happening. I love the timing of this. For many of us, we're going to be out at the RSA conference next week in San Francisco on computer security. And so we're all going to get bragging rights because we now have our manual, and everyone's going to be talking about the Tallinn Manual. And if you're here, you're going to have the inside scoop on this. So we put together a fantastic panel on this to walk through, and I'm not going to cover the bios. You've already got an introduction, and you have the bio book. And with that, I think I just want to tick right in. And you know, Mike, you've been doing this for 7 years. I don't think I've ever seen Lise happier than when she's on, kicking off the farewell tour for this, because you've done so much work and it's been so hard. And any other observations that you wanna kick us off with to start?
Yeah, when Lise started the project, she was 11 years old. At least it feels like that. And my hair was a different color. So 7 years later, boy, are we happy to be finished. So I thought what I'd do, there are just a couple comments we wanted to make. The first two are easy ones, and they're conclusions at the end of a 7-year process with 20 of the world's best lawyers. The first one is 7.5 years ago, when we started this, there was an awful lot of chatter about whether international law applied in cyberspace. Now, I have to tell you, the first group that met, there were just 5 of us that met to scope the project. It took us about 4 minutes and 22 seconds to figure out that was a nonsensical argument. Clearly, international law applied in cyberspace. Clearly it did. But the question was how it applied, given the unique nature of cyber operations. And that's what this project is about. Today, hopefully, the argument that cyberspace is a wild west, is a normative void, has been put to rest once and for all. And now it's time for states to take the baton from the Tallinn Manual group and to begin to figure out what their legal policy is based upon the conclusions, in part, that we drew. The second question, in fact, I was asked that. We had lunch today with the ambassadors, and I had an interview this morning. The second question is, there seems to be a view that there are different perspectives on international law depending on where you're at. There is the Eastern view and the Western view and the Northern view and the Southern view. Our experience, because in the second IGE, we had people from the International Group of Experts. Always give yourself a really cool title and then have an acronym for it, okay? So
the IGE, yeah,
the IGE, maybe that didn't work so well. So in the second International Group of Experts, in the second team we brought together, we were truly global. There were people from every continent. And good lawyers, the best guy from Japan, and on and on and on. And my takeaway from that is, yeah, lawyers may disagree on international law, but generally we agreed on the basics. It did not matter if it was Andrei Kozik from Minsk or Eric Jensen from BYU. If you put them in a room, which I often did as director, put them in the room when there are differences of opinion, when they came out of the room, they generally came to roughly the same conclusion. Indeed, sometimes international lawyers from the very same country were more divided than the international lawyers from different countries. So my takeaway is we have some ground from which we can develop now norms, because I believe that we're all operating from roughly the same perspective. So the big elephant in the room that we had in the project, and I think the big elephant was, is this going to be a helpful project? From a state perspective, because what you must understand is that we were not writing for academics, we were writing for countries, we were writing for legal advisors. We wanted to give people at US Cybercom a tool which they could use as they began to deconstruct what had just happened and how they could respond to it within the framework of international law. There was some concern, certainly with Tallinn 1, that we were muddling the process. Who are these people going off purporting to understand, tell us what international law is? And indeed, states, at least at the higher level, held us at arm's length. Now, I will tell you, behind the scenes, if you get old enough, you know everyone, and there were lots of phone calls, hey, what are you guys doing? What do you think about this? And so forth. But formally, they held us at arm's length because they were extraordinarily nervous about what we were doing. We were going to produce a book that would seize the normative landscape from them. Well, we did produce the book. The book, Tallinn 1, probably sits in every office, in every MFA, legal advisor's office, in every MOD legal advisor's office in the entire world, from Washington to Beijing. So the second round was very, very different. You heard the ambassador. They approached us. The Dutch approached us and said, what could we do to help you? And what we said was, what we want, because we're committed to the notion that states and only states make international law, what we want you to do is to bring states together. And the Dutch were quite extraordinary. In 3 sessions, they brought in 50 nations, including all the P5, and I'm not talking about some low-level guy in the legal device. Sometimes they're senior legal advisors, sometimes entire delegations, to feed us their views in an unofficial, non-attribution, closed-the-door environment so that the manual would at least reflect the views of states. Now, we reserve the right to look at a state, and we did that sometimes, and say, you know what, that's interesting, but that's nonsense, so we're not going to include that view in our manual. But that did not happen very often. So this is a manual. Tallinn 2 is a manual that is informed by international organizations and is informed by states. And so we hope it will be of use to them. In use to them how? Well, first of all, if it's one of the rules, it required unanimity, as Lee said. So if you're a state legal advisor and you got 20 guys, you got a kid from South Texas and one from Minsk agreeing on precisely the same text, then you got yourself a real uphill battle to try and run contrary to that norm. It doesn't say we make law, but it's going to be a tough sell to other states. More important than that, this manual, unlike every manual that was cited on the slide that Lee showed, this manual for the first time said we don't have all the answers. Cyberspace is new. There is a lot of gray out there. So although we can agree on general principles of the law that apply in the cyber context, the interpretation and application of those rules can be contentious. And instead of trying to solve the problem, instead of trying to prove that we knew more than you, what we did was capture all reasonable views and put them in the manual. So when you read the manual, sometimes it says, the majority said this, the minority said that. Sometimes it says few, that means one or two. Sometimes it says we acknowledge a view. That means none of us agreed with the view, but a state put forward the view, and we acknowledge that states get to play in international law. And so we included that view as well. So this is the most important piece of the book. The most important piece of the book isn't where we agreed, it's where we disagreed, because that's where the play should be with regard to states. States should be looking at areas where we disagreed and saying that's where states need to roll into the game and start firming up the norms, deciding what their legal policy is, and very importantly, staking out that legal policy, either through actions or opinio juris. So, opinio juris being the expression of the state's legal position in a very public manner. So I guess that's where I'll conclude. We're finished, and a number of us, Lise and I, will go to Australia, where we will turn our attention to space. We've already called ourselves the new space cadets. We're finished with cyber, and now it's for people like Gary Korn and Eric Jensen over at DoD. It's not our job anymore. It's your job to take what we've done and start figuring out what the legal position is of the United States, not so much on the black letter law positions, but on those positions where the group of experts could not figure out what the right law is.
And it really strikes me, because even after 2013, I would hear from some colleagues in saying, is a cyber attack an act of war? This is an interesting question. It's like, no, it's not. Like, that was an interesting question in 1999.
Right.
Maybe that was an interesting question in 2012, but really the question is, under what circumstances is a cyber attack an act of war? After 2013, that wasn't an interesting question. It was where the manual got it wrong, or got it right or got it wrong. And that's what I loved about that, is because it gave you that starting point of those areas of agreement or disagreement. And it really struck me when I first started meeting with you guys as part of the process, probably 2010, I think. Right. I always thought that I still thought this was maybe some contention. Every expert I would run across that wasn't actually a lawyer would say, oh man, no one agrees when, a cyber attack and where it crosses, and whether it, and what you can do, and if you can respond with kinetic to a cyber event. And then it just struck me it was Professor Winkfield here that was talking, and he was at the front of the room, and he was saying, if this happens, and then here's what the law says. And I was just waiting for everyone to jump on him, because this was supposed to be contentious. And I was so surprised to hear it not being contentious, at least among the legal scholar community, and we're so happy. So that was the Mike talking about the process and we're the legal scholars, and we're so glad that Megan Steele can join, because you've done this in both sides, right? You were at the Department of Justice, and you're having to look at what actions are lawful or unlawful in cyberspace, and you brought that to the White House. But in the White House, you're also overseeing international cyber policy. And so not just what the lawyers thought, but also what policymakers and tying that into America's diplomacy. So I'm really kind of fascinated in how you hear this and you respond to what we've come with today.
Sure. So thanks for including me in the discussion. I'm delighted and honored to be with this esteemed group of people, and I'm very appreciative of the efforts of the CCDCOE and the Embassy of the Netherlands and all of our colleagues on their work. You know, to me, this is a step in the process that is not surprisingly consistent with U.S. policy that's been evolving over the years. But the work that the U.S. government has been undertaking, as most of you know, within the group of governmental experts has been around this discussion that Jay just mentioned of does international law apply to activities in cyberspace? And yes, that was a long-standing settled question, but it was important that this group of experts, through the GGE process acknowledged it. Then the question became, how does it apply? And so for me, one of the great benefits of this manual is that it helps further the dialogue on those issues of how international law applies to state action in cyberspace.
And can I ask, so maybe not everyone knows the GGE process. So maybe, can you just do maybe 30 seconds and just highlight kind of what the UN GGE was?
I'll do my best.
Yes.
It has been a few years. But so the GGE process, the group of governmental experts process, grew out of the United Nations, now I'm at the arms control.
Yeah.
Sorry? I think so. No,
Yes.
In any event, there have been two, the first committee, thank you, that was the word I was blanking on, the first committee effort. And so there were two several year-long processes where the group of governmental experts, which began initially as a small number of countries, David can remind me exactly how many, then grew on to, similarly to this process, grew from a small group of folks to a larger group of governmental experts speaking about, again, the application of international law to state action, and came out with a unanimous position and paper, I think it was 2015, again, reiterating that yes, international law applies. The question is, how does it apply? And so as I was saying, this is a great tool to further that conversation. I think its particular utility goes not just for, is useful not just for those of us who are sitting here and in Western capitals around the world, but also for, given the proliferation of tools to the number of actors out there, be they state or non-state actors, thinking about how international law applies. There is, while I don't expect criminal groups to be pulling out the Tallinn Manual, for countries who are less experienced in this space, considering using a new technique to undertake, express their authority in this space, I think hopefully this will give them an opportunity to undertake some critical analysis before they, for lack of a better word, hit enter.
Yeah, and it really struck me. I'd have a lot of folks that, you know, and Mike covered this and saying, well, there are no rules of the road. And that's just simply not true. Or people say cyberspace is borderless. And well, that's not really true. I mean, a lot of the concepts like sovereignty do fit very strongly into what you talk about here. And even when I hear people say, well, do we need we need a new treaty to handle what's going to cover in cyberspace? And I say, well, there are treaties, right? And that's so much of what is happening here, is saying we've got treaties. We've got the Geneva Treaty. We've got the Hague Convention. We've got all sorts of treaties that do apply here. And that's why I was so happy when the GGE said existing international laws apply, because now that does mean we are more rooted in this. And that comes up a lot. And I mean, was that in over 2015, we really saw America pushing norms. Yes. Secretary Kerry in Seoul laying out what the U.S. norms are going to be, that really picked up through the G20 and other countries. And how does international law fit in with those norms that the Obama administration had been pushing?
So I again would think that this is, the discussion here will reflect, or the discussion in the manual will reflect the government's, the U.S. government's articulation of the norms that it has put forward, and is through work with a number of entities, including the G20, has come to consensus on this notion that there are certain norms that are obviously reflective of customary international law, building upon treaty law. The other thing I would say about the utility of this manual is the method through which it was developed. So the notion of collaborative consultation, not only with academics but also with practitioners in capitals, I think it's truly useful, because it doesn't, it reflects what's in the minds of these individuals, reflects, maybe not in all cases as we've learned, but I think it would be hard pressed for anyone would be hard-pressed to disagree with one of the rules that the manual articulates, given the collaborative and consultative nature through which it was developed with states not only, again, in Western capitals, but around the world. But I think, to your point, to your question, Jay, the idea of norms development, I think is, as Mike was saying, getting to the areas where we might disagree. Presumably, we're not disagreeing on norms because they reflect customary international law, but looking at the norms development, I think will hopefully evolve to a place where we're getting to answer some of those great questions.
Yeah, and you know, especially in some of the UNGGE and other conversations with China, I'd heard, you know, specifically about China, but again, this is in general in diplomacy. A lot of times a country doesn't want to be left out. If it looks like there's a growing consensus, they say, we don't want to be the one that's left out on that. We at least need a few allies on this position. And that's why I think this is going to help, because it really starts cementing that in what that norm is going to be. That's why I was so glad to hear that you had a Chinese scholar involved in this. So as an American, I think I've got sometimes a jaded view of international law. And it was with a conversation I was having with someone from the Netherlands, and they said, look, we're not a huge power, a superpower like the United States. We can't rely on power to defend ourselves. We've got to rely on law. And that was on international law. And it just flipped a switch in my mind to think about that different relationship that you have with international order. You know, can you enforce order because you've got strong armies, or do you look for strong order based on the rule of law? And so we're really happy that okay, you're on the panel today. And I didn't even know until I read I was going to ask why the Netherlands has been so active in this, and the ambassador covered that. And in the foreword by your foreign minister, I didn't know this, that it's even in the Constitution that the Netherlands government needs to push to help promulgate international law.
That's right. I mean, it's on our Constitution, Article 97, I believe, that the government is ordered to promote the development of the international legal order, and we take that very seriously. So, I mean, let me just explain a little bit about why we jumped on this opportunity and why we undertook the activities that we did. I mean, the ambassador mentioned that, you know, having a free and open, a secure, and a peaceful cyberspace has really become a strategic interest for the Netherlands, because we're just so dependent on it. But as you can imagine, we have, you know, strong concerns about the direction and the development of the strategic threat environment and some of the activities that we've been seeing over the past few years. And we're concerned that it's beginning to display tendencies of a classic security dilemma, where you know, everybody's developing their capabilities because they're afraid of the other guy, but that in turn leads to more uncertainty and fear on the opposing side, and you know, that gets you into the risk of an arms race and gets you not into a very good place. So the question is, you know, really, how do you create and maintain stability under that security dilemma, where you have multiple players? And I'm no expert on game theory, but I understand that there's a couple of ways to maintain stability or to manage a security dilemma. And first option is you can stop playing, you can withdraw unilaterally, but you know, that's not really realistic. Secondly, you can you know, build up your own capabilities in such a way that you don't have to fear anyone. So you can aim for deterrence. And by the way, we're not as powerful as the U.S., but our guys, they do okay. I have no fear there.
Did not mean to insult Dutch actors, sorry.
But you know, in the long term, you're right. That, you know, that is not a very reassuring path to take. So the third option is to try and negotiate your way out of a security dilemma, to try for a long-term structural solution by trying to build what we call a normative framework to regulate cyber operations between states. And in our view, I mean, naturally, given our history or the role that we've played over the last century in promoting international law, we feel that international law should be the main component of that normative framework, because we strongly feel that that is, international law is mostly sufficient to regulate most activities that are of concern. And it's really international law that can provide the measure of predictability and stability and who knows, even a degree of accountability to help maintain stability. But that only works when everyone is on the same page. So we really need what the GGE called common understandings about how international law applies. And that requires that we really make international law more accessible, more understandable, and more practically applicable to not just the main cyber powers, but everyone who can be affected by this new threat. And I think that is where the manual can really play a very useful role.
That's great. And, I've got a follow-up question on that. But if you want to start catching my attention, I'm not going to do a lengthy Q&A up here because we've got such a fantastic crowd here. I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions. If you want to start catching my eye, we'll start getting the microphones around if anyone has questions. Was that a question? Okay. If someone has a question, just catch my attention. If not, I'm going to jump right in because I really like what Rutger did there. Because he was saying this is about the dynamics of cyber conflict. And we need to worry about how, sometimes we'll talk about state behavior in this space. And that's useful. But tying it in with what are the dynamics of cyber conflict and how are those similar or different to conflict in the air, land, and sea? So the security dilemma says when one side is building capabilities, the other side will see that because of the anarchic nature of the world. Right? There's no world government. So when you see someone else arming, that you build up your arms too, and you end up in spiral escalation. And there's another way that you can get yourself out of a security dilemma. My colleague, Professor Jervis at Columbia, said a security dilemma is doubly dangerous if it's offense dominant and you can't distinguish offense from defense. Sound familiar? And so he said, if you can get defense in such a place to get defense advantage, so that it's not offense dominant, it's more defense dominant, that's another way out of the security dilemma, because then as each side builds their own defensive cyber capabilities, the other side now says, all right, I understand this is defensive. And so this is one thing that we've been talking about here at the Atlantic Council with a report we launched last month called A Non-State Strategy for Saving Cyberspace. If we can make cyberspace more defense advantage so that the attackers don't have the advantage, that way, if the US is spending on, say, cyber command, or as we're building new cyber commands, it's more difficult for the other side to imagine that's all going to be for offensive purposes. And so thanks for bringing that up. I'm curious, Megan, so you're both a lawyer, and of course wanting to push international law as part of that, but also you were working with America's diplomats in the State Department. So this may be a little awkward question, but how did you work between that and saying, all right, we being both a lawyer and in your own way a diplomat? Was there inherent tension in that as being a practitioner in this space?
I don't think so. Maybe that was by virtue of the benefit of the wonderful colleagues that I had within the Department of State, including in L, which is the legal office, and some of whom I know contributed to the report. But also, I think perhaps because of where where you sit is where you stand, my viewpoint was from the Department of Justice, which was frequently seeing things in a common light as our colleagues at State were. Hopefully that's not portraying too much, but the short answer is no.
Yeah, it's good. And it's interesting, the U.S. was the first country that really had a position like Chris Painter's, that was America's top cyber. And it seems like, do you know how many countries are doing that? It seems like there's several dozen that are.
Yes, the number has grown exponentially, and that is obviously a positive thing, we think, to the extent that governments are thinking about these things collectively as opposed to one component of a government kind of leading the charge and the others suddenly catching up. Yeah. We don't think that the U.S. government at the time when I was there, and I think at this point still doesn't think that approach is less preferable to one where there's a unified, collaborative approach.
And I think that might help with the manual, because now you've got a head diplomat. Okay, we've got one in the back there, and then if I could get another mic in the front here, and then we've got this gentleman here. Okay, yeah, in the back.
Hi.
Is that Nick? Hi.
Joe Marks from Nexo.
Joe.
Thanks very much for doing this. I'm wondering if you can go into some more detail about where the beneath the level of armed conflict lines are drawn in the second version of this manual.
Can you stand just so we can see you? All right,
Hi.
great. Go ahead. Thanks.
Joe Marks from NextGov. I'm wondering, first, if you can tell us some of the interesting things about where the lines are drawn beneath the level of armed conflict in this second version of the manual. And then second, you've mentioned, a couple of people have mentioned the DNC breaches as one of those beneath the level of armed conflict incidents that this would be useful addressing. Address it, and what does this manual tell us about that breach and how it relates to laws and norms?
So we need to be careful about terminology. So let me do law professor stuff first. We need to distinguish between the issue of when does a state's cyber operation constitute what's called a use of force under international law in violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. That's what we most often think about, violating 2.4. The experts agreed that anytime there's a cyber operation that causes destruction or injury that's beyond the de minimis standard, in other words, incidental, minor standard, that constituted a use of force by another state. We need to be careful because that doesn't necessarily mean the victim state can respond with a corresponding use of force. That's a different body of law known as the law of self-defense, and it has its own criteria. Now, the big question is, what about cyber operations that manifest with consequences below that level, below that destructive level? That's an area where I was talking about. That's a gray zone. We agreed almost uniformly. There were a couple dissenters. They would be wrong. We agreed almost across the group that you can have a cyber operation that is not destructive and it is not injurious, but it could qualify as a use of force. But we could come up with no bright line test because there's insufficient state practice to look at, and states have not spoken to the issue. And we weren't in the business of making law. That's what states do. So what we did instead is offer a series of factors that states will consider when determining whether to characterize a particular cyber operation as a use of force. I want to say there are 8 or so factors. Things like how direct were the consequences. In other words, if you have a cyber operation, the consequences occur very quickly, immediately, or in the longer term. How severe were the consequences obviously was a factor. Were the consequences measurable or not? And on and on and on. Now, your question was framed in terms of armed conflict, and that's why I want to be precise. The term armed conflict in law, in international law, is the term we use for what a non-lawyer would call war. Okay? War, in a sense of the law of war, what we would call the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law applies. There are 2 types of these conflicts. One is international armed conflict, conflict between states, and the other is what's called non-international armed conflict. The non-lawyer would call it internal conflict. In the case of international armed conflict, the experts agreed that international armed conflict exists, and therefore the law of war kicks in. In other words, you can directly kill people and so forth. The rule of proportionality applies and so forth. When there are hostilities between states, and again, we agreed that in the event that there's an exchange between 2 states and there's damage or destruction, and most of us said no matter how slight, you're in an armed conflict for as long as that lasts. In an internal armed conflict, we said it is theoretically possible for an internal conflict to occur by virtue of the operations of a non-state group against a state, but it'd be very, very, very difficult to meet the legal criteria, and it would take an hour to explain that to you.
It really caught me when, as I've been listening to to the deliberations over the course of the manual, is that when you cross that line over to armed attack, it's not a cyber war, it's a war, right? I mean, once you're past that line.
When you cross the line of armed conflict, it's a war.
Right.
And it's a war in the sense that if it was initiated by cyber means, you can have, since I'm at the United States Naval War College, the 7th Fleet engage in kinetic operations against the other side.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there was a second question. It's a DNC hack question. Wow.
I thought you were avoiding that.
No, I'm very surprised you asked that. I had not anticipated that particular question. So,
can we let's hold on
absolutely.
DNC for a second, and then, because I think Rico wanted to.
What struck me about your question was that it really demonstrated how much the line between armed conflict and peacetime is still the standard against which we measure all these incidents. And it's not surprising because, first of all, that's serious stuff. That's what every state is most worried about. But also practically, that's what the discussion has been dominated by, because we had Tallinn 1, we had, the International Red Cross did some work on that. So that was just what it was on everyone's agenda. That was what everyone was familiar with. Now, I've been all around the world, sat in many, many conferences and workshops and seminars with other countries where we've talked about the need for this normative framework, the need to get some diplomatic solutions to this threat, that was the case there as well. The question of when is cyber an armed attack, when has it crossed the threshold of use of force, that was always on the agenda. But I can tell you from the colleagues from State Department who are here, who will have experienced the same thing. When you talk about those kinds of issues with countries from Southeast Asia or Latin America or Africa or those are not the issues that they're concerned about. That's not what's relevant for them on a daily basis. So my hope is that the release of the manual can help us get away from that discussion a little bit and start focusing more on those issues that are more relevant on a daily basis, and to have the peacetime international law as the point of departure rather than the jus ad bellum or the jus in bello.
So
Please.
That's a wonderful comment. Let me tell you a little story about Tallinn 1. When we were doing Tallinn 1, we produced a manual that dealt only with the use of force and the law of war. That was the first draft. States weren't formally involved, but we knew some people that worked for government. And one of the people I knew was Sir Daniel Bethlehem, who was then the legal advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And he's a great mind and a great lawyer. So I said, listen, Daniel, would you mind taking a look at our little book and tell us what you think? And he said, sure. And so I went down to the FCO after he had plenty of time to look at it. And it was terrifying. I went into his office and he had the book, the draft, and it must have 350 little Post-it notes, which I assume were all mistakes. But at any rate, he said something very, very important. He said, the problem with your book is that if all you have in life is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And you've just written a book about cyber war, about cyber uses of forces. But that's not what happens. What happens on a day-to-day basis are the lower level cyber operations. But the lawyers don't have anything else. So when the lawyer is asked by his or her client in the FCO or the State Department or the Department of Defense, they're going to pull out the book and they're going to start analyzing it in terms of war. And that's going to be destabilizing. I found this to be a very, very compelling comment. So I went back to the group after meeting with Daniel. And we quickly, in the last year, you remember, in the last year, we generated 9 quick rules on sovereignty and state responsibility and so forth. Those are the first rules in the book. So we knew when we came out of that process and into the next process that that's where the weight of effort had to go. because that's where people dealt with on a day-to-day basis, and we didn't want to create an environment in which the first question was always, was that an act of war? I mean, you probably heard recently there have been characterizations, the DNC hack has an act of war. We didn't want people to think about that because that's very, very destabilizing. Hence, Tallinn 2.0 and 300 pages of dense text on peacetime cyber operations.
Megan, any color you'd like to add? I mean, so from the decision making, I mean, within the White House, you know, a lot of times we hear international law, what's it, I mean, does it really make a difference? And
I think that obviously it
yeah,
does.
I'm not asking a
Say
lawyer,
yes.
so right.
Yes.
Say yes.
I think in some ways, stating the obvious, it goes without saying that the United States has been leading in this space. And so it's hard to imagine the United States not taking a very measured approach and a very deliberate approach to this effort and attempting to work with allies and partners to try and ensure that this is a holistic effort, and international law is a vehicle to that end, and obviously one that we support significantly.
It reminds me, I'll be the first one to throw out the Stuxnet, that, you know, it reminds me of Dick Clark's comment that he was betting that the U.S. was involved because it looked like lawyers were deeply involved in writing this code. Sorry for the delay there. We had a long question.
Eric Jensen, Brigham Young University. I know, Mike, that you have said on a number of occasions, and Lee's introduced it this way, that this was really about Lex Lata. But I've heard you say about Tallinn 1 that if you were trying to project what part of Tallinn 1 would change, it might be the treatment of data as an object. I'm wondering if you would speculate as to what you think might change 5 years from now with respect to the rules in Tallinn 2.
Well, that's a great question. Eric was a member of both international group of experts and a key player. What he's referring to is in Tallinn 1, we came to the conclusion that the majority came to the conclusion that data is, I don't know if it's is or art because I was educated at Southwest Texas State University, but I don't know if the question was, is data an object? Why would we care about such a question? The reason is, under the law of armed conflict, you may not direct attacks against civilian objects, thereby raising the question, if I'm conducting cyber operations that destroys or alters data, that manipulates data, is this an attack such that the operation, if directed against civilian data, constitutes not only a violation of the law of war, but also a war crime? We concluded that it did not by looking at the history, negotiating history, and so forth. And I've always been very, very uneasy about that. And the reason I'm uneasy about that conclusion is, although we were trying to be objective, and although I believe that objectively we came to the right answer, what bothered me was that allowed states, armed forces, to take off the gloves a bit too much. I mean, really, do we really want to say that if we're involved in an armed conflict with another state that's cyber capable, that other state can do anything to data it wants, so long as we all agreed if the loss of the data results in death, so example, destruction of medical records, which is specially protected anyways, can't be done. But do we really want to say all of that civilian data and all the systems? I don't think we want to say that. But on the other hand, in the battle space, because we have military officers here, you know that you already regularly engage in military operations that involve the destruction of data, and you don't want to take that off the table, if only for PSYOPs. So we were stuck with this dilemma. My view is that rule will change. And I've proposed a remedy for this. I believe that we should engage in practice where we, as a matter of policy and ultimately as a matter of law, take data involving essential civilian functions off the table. I've written an article on this. You can read it. And I think that that's starting to gain traction, I believe. I know that the ICRC is starting to take this approach. I also realize that saying the ICRC has adopted your view is not necessarily convincing to everyone in the room, but I do believe we're moving to this. So with regard to Tallinn 2, I mean, I could duck your question by coming up with some law of the sea example, but I think it's going to be sovereignty. I think it's going to be sovereignty. And the reason is we are not sure where the line lies with regard to the violation of the sovereignty of a state with respect to remote cyber operations. There are some who I have extraordinarily deep respect for, that say there is not even a rule of sovereignty, but rather sovereignty is a principle from which other rules emanate. Okay. I don't agree with that, but I respect the people who hold this view. However, as states begin to suffer cyber operations that are harmful in nature, we are going to desperately search, as we are desperately searching for a legal, how to characterize the DNC hacks, we are going to desperately search for a way to say to another state, you can't do that as a matter of law. And the easiest way to do that is by resort to a principle of sovereignty. Because we would all agree that states are sovereign over their territory, and we would all agree that states are sovereign over the individuals and their activities and the cyber infrastructure, the objects on their territory. So where I believe we will start to see some firming up of the rules of the game, if you will, one way or another. Because remember, if you make the normative wall of sovereignty too high, well, pursuant to the principle of sovereign equality, it blocks your operations. So we're going to be forced to see states struggle with, is there a violation of sovereignty? Is there such a thing? And if so, where does that lie? And I think that debate will move pretty quickly as hostile cyber operations unfold, because if you're sitting in L, or if you're over at the Department of Justice, if you're at Cybercom, if you're at DoD, Eric, you know, because you're there for a year, people are going to ask you the question. You can't just look at them, you know, like we say in Texas, you can't just stand there like a deer in headlights staring at them. They're your client. You need to give them the best shot. And so I think that's where we're going to see most of the action.
And I think that in the U.S. we've made this a little bit tougher on ourselves because we've so focused since 2003, say, on cyber. You know, that we might have been, you know, in the 90s, it was about information operations. We were including and thinking more deeply about influence, propaganda, about how all of the, you know, a little bit more Toffler, third wave kind of stuff, and how all of these fit together. And to me, data is fitting in with that information, right? What struck us about Sony or the DNC is it was less about the cyber, it was less interesting from a cyber perspective than information.
Right.
So, Eddie, before I go to the next question, okay, sir, thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Hi, Rick Weber at Insight Cybersecurity. Could the panel talk a little bit about where the manual comes down on the use of active defensive measures, and could you talk a little bit about the role of non-state actors?
Yep. Well, it's a manual question, so
it's okay.
Mike, if you want to lead us off, and then.
So the manual doesn't talk about active defensive measures. What the manual talks about are responses. Now, with respect to a robust response at the use of force level, the condition precedent, what you got to have first under the law of self-defense is an armed attack. So before you launch cyber operations that are themselves destructive or injurious, or effect a major, major impact on another state, in Mike Schmidt's view, not the view of every member of the group, before you do that, you've got to have that type of operation launched about you, launched at you. So that's the highest level. So active defense, you're shooting back at that level against that type of operation, that's what you got to have. You got to have that type of operation coming in.
Because why?
Ma'am?
Because?
because of the law of self-defense, because the operation coming in must qualify under law as an armed attack before your right to engage in those sorts of robust cyber or kinetic operations matures, kicks in. Now, break, we'll move down one level. International law provides, and that's why this debate over is it illegal or not to manipulate elections. At the next level down, going down in level of oomph, okay, or it's a legal term. University of Texas, second year. As we go down to the next level, we're in the realm of what are called countermeasures. And I'm not talking about the sort of countermeasures that most people in the audience that are non-lawyers are thinking about, what you do in response. It's not for General Rockwell, it's not popping chaff out of your cosmic all-weather fighter bomber. Okay, that's not that kind of, I'm talking about countermeasures, a term of art in international law. And a countermeasure is defined as an act that would be unlawful, but for the fact that it responds to an act that's unlawful and is designed to force the other state back into compliance with the law. So state A commits a violation of international law against state B. State B gets to do what would otherwise be unlawful, but not as a form of retaliation. When you hear retaliation, a lawyer hears retaliation, they swallow their tongue. There's no such thing in international law. But has a way to compel the other side back into a lawful course of action. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a hackback that, for example, constitutes a violation of sovereignty or a wrongful intervention that allows the state to, an attack that then allows the victim state to hack back, to do something equally bad to the other side because there's a condition of proportionality. Now, and the last level is called retorsion. Retorsion is an unfriendly but not unlawful act in international law. So let's take two wildly hypothetical examples: expelling diplomats and imposing sanctions. These were acts of retorsion, not a countermeasure, because although they may have been unfriendly, if you will, they are certainly not unlawful. It is the sovereign prerogative of states to expel diplomats and to impose sanctions. So those are your three levels. That's why it's so important to get the law right, because if you were listening carefully, what you learned was that your ability to shoot back, if you will, to respond, the robustness, the nature, the character of the response is dependent entirely upon the legal nature of the cyber operation directed against you.
So I'd like to make this practical. And for the microphones, we had a question. No, we don't have a question here. We had the next question was going to be here. And then I think the next question over there was the gentleman there. And so if you want to get the mic over there, and then I'll come to them when they're. I want to make this a little bit more pointed. Because I've got David Lashway right in the front seat. And I know David has been in the trenches on seeing the terrible, just day after day of intrusion after intrusion after intrusion by state-sponsored groups. And so I want to pick on this active defense a little bit. One of the things that we might say is we've got the National Mission Force, National Mission Team at Cyber Command. We want to get them out there and into the adversary's infrastructure to disrupt their command and control infrastructure because they're doing unto us.
During a war or during peacetime?
Day to day, during peacetime, during whatever you're calling today, or even saying, we had, I was saying the Russians get into our election, are messing with our elections. Let's get in there. We've got the National Mission Team. We know APT 28, APT 29. We know their infrastructure. Let's get those operators up at Cyber Command up into the Russian infrastructure to disrupt their operations against our elections. I say, I'm not usually a bloodthirsty one, but on that one I was a bit bloodthirsty. Tell me that was legal.
All right, it was legal.
All right, good, all right.
A good lawyer tells his client whatever the client wants to hear and makes it sound profound and well thought out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is DNC hack. Do you want me to analyze that? As you raised that? No, you want to save that for the end or something? Is that the grand finale?
Go ahead.
Maybe the second part of the question was the role of non-state actors and how the manual addresses the role of non-state actors.
Yep.
And while I have not had the privy of having extensive opportunity to review the contents of the manual, I did note that it talks about what has been a question that is not boggled, but it has been on the minds of many in this space of, so non-state actors in some instances can be proxies of a state. And so the manual talks about, I think, the point at which non-state actors' actions, when they're under the direction and control of a state, may be attributed to the state, which then, as Mike was explaining, opens up this body of rubric under which a state has to adjudicate its response. So I think that maybe you transition from perhaps the DNC hack to other actors.
I'm not allowed to talk about the DNC hack. We've already established that.
I guess I'm rolling back the clock a bit.
No, I mean, I think your legal
10 years
analysis is 100% correct. You hit exactly the right terminology. In international law, a state is responsible for the actions of a non-state actor, like a terrorist group, a hacker group, when that state instructs or directs or controls. We have a long section in the manual. We don't have time here to explain the difference between instructions and direction control. But the sort of catch-all phrase that lawyers used is when the state is in effective control of the non-state actors, of the hacker group. In other words, it can tell the group what to do and what not to do. That's effective control, right? So in the event that the non-state actors are in effective control of a state, and those non-state actors do anything that would violate international law, if it had been conducted by the state, then the state is responsible under international law, which is very, very important. Because remember the discussion of countermeasures. Countermeasures a violation of international law opens the door to countermeasures. So if you have a non-state group launching harmful cyber operations against a state, but you determine that that group is in the effective control of the state, then you may launch countermeasures, operations that would otherwise be unlawful, back against not only the group, but the state itself. Because the non-state actors are the equivalent of the armed forces, if you will, in a very rough analogy.
And this is why I always thought we shouldn't be talking about attribution. We should be talking about determining national responsibility. Because to me, I think that national responsibility includes that concept in a way that attribution necessarily doesn't, Rutger.
Well, just on the first part of the question on active cyber defense, I mean, fortunately, the Netherlands has not been in a position yet where we've suffered an incident that would require us to think in that way, but we're seeing it happen all around us. So it is very important for us to know that international law does offer us these options of being able to respond. Right. And you mentioned a few. I believe there are a couple of others as well. But the principle of being able to take unilateral action in some cases is very important, and that's a principle that we're defending in ongoing international negotiations now. And again, we're not doing that because the manual says so. We're doing that because it's an accepted principle of international law. And again, we're not asking anyone to sign up on the manual. We don't see it as an official document. We haven't asked any of the countries who participated in the Hague process to do so. Again, the point is that the manual is just a very, very helpful resource that helps you get to a higher level of granularity, more detail when you're having these discussions.
And I love that, because so often we think of international law as being the restraint of what you can't do. And what you were saying in there is, by having more clarity, it can enable more cyber operations, having that clear.
Don't get me wrong. We primarily see international law as a shield, something that protects us and something that protects everyone. And it's the prohibitions in international law that I think are very relevant. The main ones being the prohibition on the use of force, the prohibition on intervention, and the prohibition on violating someone else's sovereignty. I think those are three key principles that, had they been given more attention during previous stages of this international debate, that could have, provided reassurance to a lot of countries that have instead look to other or alternative made proposals for new rules and try to negotiate on that. And you know, we've pointed out that that is not necessary because we already have so much that covers that.
And I didn't mean to stifle the bit on the DNC. I actually thought you had covered the DNC. So.
Well, the DNC is the most asked question that we've gotten a lot from the press. So the DNC is an interesting example of what we call, or what I've called, the gray zone of international law.
And to catch everyone up, in case you missed it, DNC got hacked by the Russians. That was it was in the news. So yeah, Google that one. So yeah.
So are we sure now that the Russians did it? So the DNC hack. This was a very, very interesting case because this was, in my view, an illustration of the Russians operating in a legal gray zone. What would you call the DNC hack? I mean, the best bet, the best argument is that it was a prohibited intervention under international law. International law prohibits one state from intervening in the internal affairs, what a lawyer calls domaine réservé, a French term thereby justifying what the lawyer is charging you. The domaine réservé, the area where another state has exclusive right to operate in a coercive manner. And coercive simply means it causes the other state to do something that it would otherwise not do, or to refrain from taking an action that it would otherwise take. Okay, so this is the closest thing we can pin on the Russians. Because, and I should have said this earlier, because espionage, a number of people in the audience will be pleased to know, is not a violation of international law. Okay, espionage is not the violation of international law. Although the means by which espionage is carried out may violate international, but not espionage. There's no, you engage in espionage. So the Russians engage in what is effectively espionage, but we can't pin the rose on them for that. So the only thing left is intervention. Clearly, it's within our domaine réservé. Indeed, in the manual, which was written before this, when we wanted to illustrate domaine réservé, elections is what we came up with. It's the example in the book, because it's the cleanest example of domaine réservé, choosing one's own representatives, so choosing one's own government. So the whole question boils down to the issue of the second element, which is coercion. Did this make us do something we would otherwise not have done, blah, 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 blah. So there are two views. Unfortunately, the manual doesn't handle this. We didn't anticipate this. And so there are two views, one represented by my colleague Lise over here, and one represented by me. We worked together closely, and we've been arguing over this for quite some time, and we're very close. We just fall. Each of us falls just slightly on the other side of the line. So, speaking for Lise, what I would say, if I were Lise, what I would say is, listen. Okay, espionage is not unlawful. Okay, so let's move on from that. That leaves intervention. Are you really telling me that providing an electorate in a liberal democracy with truthful material is intervention? I mean, for crying out loud, we've been doing that for centuries. I mean, I remember the Cold War. We have whole organizations devoted to that. So it can't possibly be coercion to be providing people information upon which they will make a better informed decision. That's option one, and that's entirely reasonable. That's an entirely reasonable legal conclusion. It's not the conclusion I've drawn. I'm on the other side, but just slightly over the line. What I say is, even though the fact that they violated our domestic law is not usually relevant in an international law analysis, what states' laws they have, it doesn't have any bearing on what international law is. In this case, there was a manipulation of our process in a way, it was never intended to be manipulated. I mean, you know, they committed a crime in order to acquire the information and released it in a manner that arguably could have influenced. By the way, it doesn't have to influence the election. As long as there was an attempt, it's a violation of international law. But it was the manipulation of the process of us selecting a leader. I happen to believe this view is reasonable, okay? That should come as no surprise, but I think both views are reasonable. Now, why is this important? It's important because these gray areas are areas where we will say states intentionally operate in. Why? Because it's, I mean, trust me, Estonians are not friends of the Russians, okay? But nevertheless, a spectacular Estonian attorney has objectively come to the conclusion it wasn't a violation. So in this case, the Russians have selected an area of law in which to operate, in which it will be hard for states to come to a consensus that they have violated international law. We will be squabbling among each other in the interagency process and the international process over did they do it and did they violate international law or not. If only because, remember, if they did violate international law, that opens up the notion of countermeasures, which enables us to respond much more robustly. Indeed, we responded in a relatively mild manner. This is not criticism of the response, but we responded in legally mild manner known as retorsion. So, you know, I think we can expect to see this if states don't, you know, frankly, move forward with a little more dispatch and a little more focus. Our opponents are going to play in this gray area. Remember, I mean, the Russians are masters. It's not that they're bad lawyers. It's quite the opposite. It's that they're spectacular lawyers. They're spectacular. And we saw this in the Ukraine. I mean, does anyone remember that the Ukraine and Russia are still at war as a matter of law? That Russia is in belligerent occupation of Ukrainian territory, but it's hard to remember that because they were so masterful in the way they did it. The little green men, the election with the annexation, this is legally fuzzy stuff, intentionally fuzzy, intentionally fuzzy. And so I think we need to move out with a bit more dispatch in these gray areas of international law. And frankly, it's our hope that the manual helps states identify those gray areas so they know where to focus their effort as they move forward.
And I was reading an essay by Stanley Hoffman on international law, and it really struck me in a quote, "International law is merely a magnifying mirror that reflects faithfully and crucially the essence and logic of international politics. The nature of the international system condemns international law to all the weaknesses and perversions that it is so easy to deride." Right, because when we're hearing this, we're saying, well, great, I mean, this is so messy, this isn't going to be any help. But that's faithfully reflecting that the international system is messy itself. Sir, thanks for your patience.
Yes, Andrew Ferguson from the Institute for Defense Analyses. Now that you guys have put out Tallinn 2, and it's a lot more looking at sort of the messy or gray area of states' interaction in the international system, I wanted to ask how you guys addressed in this new manual a lot of the new technology that has come up, a lot of the old laws. The United States is a perfect example of this. A lot of the cyber operations laws that are held, the Cybercom is held to, were written back in the 80s and early 90s before we have things like IoT and things like that. So how did you guys address this in the new Tallinn Manual? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Well, I mean, we didn't have much of a struggle, to be honest with you. I mean, international law is designed to, international law is kind of fuzzy. If you haven't figured that out, you probably haven't been paying much attention. It's a little bit fuzzy, and it's fuzzy intentionally because international law is a product of a discussion among states, and states come to the table from very different perspectives. But international law is designed to survive in the future. So when the diplomats get together to try and come up with an international norm, it will by nature be vague just by virtue of the process, but it will to some extent be vague because you want it to survive. So it is not an uncommon thing for a treaty to predate the advent of technology, whether it be cyber or the flavor of the day is in international law is currently robotics and AI and so forth. What we usually find is that initially the international legal community flails around. Oh my God, you know, the international law needs to be changed. I'm like, we need a new Geneva Convention, da. And I'm old enough, and some of the people are, to remember, for example, the advent of precision weapons. I mean, when we got PGMs and it's like big lawyer flail, we got to use it every time, because we were watching the first Gulf War, you know, missiles go through windows and so. When everyone drinks a glass of calm down, okay, when we get past the initial excitement, what we find is that international law is pretty good at anticipating new things. So whether, I'll give you an example that is my embarrassment, okay? We have him in the audience, Brett. There's Brett there. He's got a big Band-Aid on his head, I hope. So Brett is a genius techie guy from the Naval Postgraduate School, I think, still. He was one of our technical advisors, and perhaps the most important one, in Tallinn 1.0. Brett kept using this term cloud. Now, at this point, I did not even have a phone, not an iPhone 7, like no phone, okay? I had a phone, it was in my hotel room, okay? And Brett kept talking about, everyone's talking about the cloud this, the cloud that, the cloud that. What the hell the cloud was? What are these guys talking about, you know? And so I thought the cloud was like up there, because that's why they must have called it the cloud. I mean, techies are pretty smart, so why would you call cloud anything other than something up there? No, I didn't think it was, before you think I'm the village idiot, I didn't think it was a cloud, okay? But I did think that it was somehow like radio waves. Now, I kept asking him, like, well, how do explain. Eventually, I understood that it was about stuff. Another University of Texas legal term, stuff, okay? It was about servers and routers and submarine cables and all of this. Now, once I get this as a lawyer, now I understand. Because the principle of sovereignty applies to stuff on your territory, which meant that you have jurisdiction over it, you can regulate it, you have the right to protect it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything started to fall into place. So we generally find that international law, and we found that international law, if we thought hard about it, it was a very adaptable body of law. That was not always the case. And there was a question on the use of force. I think I would be fair to say we struggled with the use of force, because this was different. I mean, I used to be a targeting officer. Stuff blows up. I got that. But this notion of causing harm through non-kinetic means, this was hard. This was hard. But by and large, it wasn't problematic. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, Rutger was looking to get it.
Yeah, just to add to what Mike said, I mean, one of the reasons that the Netherlands is so skeptical about the need for a new treaty or new binding legal rules is that we, as I said, we think that the current legal regime is largely sufficient, exactly because the underlying principles are to a large degree universal, and they're technology neutral. Now, it could eventually be the case that we come to the conclusion that we need something else, and that's why we're having this international conversation about the norms. In the UNGGE, we're having this conversation about what's called non-binding, voluntary norms of responsible state behavior, which are seen as additional norms in addition to what we have legally. And one of the reasons I think that international law is largely sufficient is that most of it is based on what we call the effects-based approach. Mm-hmm. It's not about the specific cause or the specific technology, it's about the effect that's generated by that, and that is the same whether you use a PGM or a cyber op.
And the talk on the new treaty, it was in 2010. There was an important American lawyer that was talking about the need that we did need that existing laws weren't enough, but it would be very, very easy for us to adapt to this. All we needed to do was to change the North Atlantic Treaty. All we need to do is change the Geneva Convention, and all we need to do was modify the UN Charter, and that would bring and that's all we had to do. And so I think we all felt great at that. Sir over here, and then we're going to go to David in the front.
Hi, Greg Nojheim, Center for Democracy and Technology.
Thanks for coming, Greg.
Good to see you.
Hi. So, practical question. Say, Mike, you were in the Trump administration at
Yeah,
state.
okay. This is a hypothetical, right?
Hypothetically speaking, right. And something like the Sony hack. Say the Sony hack happened, and you knew that your client wanted to do something really aggressive. Name 3 aggressive things that could be done in a situation like the Sony hack that weren't done. That could be done under the consistent with the manual.
So it's North Korea, right? So this is not a fair hypothetical. So the first thing you could do is shoot back at their private cyber infrastructure as well. You could, as a state, do so because I believe the Sony hack was in fact a violation of U.S. sovereignty because it was robust enough to constitute a violation. And you violate sovereignty irrespective of whether the target of the cyber operation is private or government. And you violate it, by the way, irrespective of the nationality of the cyber infrastructure. It's on your territory. You enjoy the right to protect it. And any operation directed against it is a violation of your sovereignty, thereby opening the door to countermeasures. And I think we could reasonably conclude that the North Koreans were likely to do it again. So the first thing I would do is shoot back at their robust private cyber infrastructure. And I believe that you could do that in a way that really bricked it and so forth. The second thing that comes to mind is that what I would do is, or what I could do, not would do, could do, would be to disrupt their government functions. Because again, you're not supposed to disrupt the inherently governmental functions of another state, but if the door is open by virtue of their internationally wrongful act, a proper countermeasure would be to disrupt the functioning of their government. I'm not quite sure how that works in North Korea, but at any rate. And then the third thing we need to remember is that countermeasures can be taken, they don't have to be in kind at all. So we could, for example, we could, this is a far-fetched example, but if we had North Korean ships that would normally transit through our territorial sea in what's called innocent passage, we could preclude, and that's a legal right under the law of the sea treaty and conventional law of the sea, we could say, no, you're not going to do that anymore. We're going to block that off because countermeasures can be different. It's just you take an action designed to get them to knock it off. So I've given you 3 examples that would normally be unlawful, but because their operation represented a violation of our sovereignty, we're permitted to do that, although only for the purpose of ensuring that they don't conduct further operations against anything on the United States, any U.S. territory.
I've got one quick follow-up. Megan, you were around some of those decisions. I'm curious if you can say anything about this, and then we are getting close to time, so we'll get David in the front. There's a few others that had their hands up. I'll try to get to you. It seemed like some of the attacks from Sony were taking place from within China or from other countries, and so what do we know about this if that country was not taking steps? I mean, China knew that they were there. What steps might we have taken with regard to those other countries? For you. And then see, because I'm not sure what Megan can say, so I'm giving her time to think about what.
There, so.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I can speculate all I want.
Yeah. Great. Good.
So,
we'll take it all.
So to restate the question, what if are they conducted by the North Koreans from China?
Yes.
Okay. Conducted by State A from territory in State B into State C. In this particular case, the state from which the operations are being conducted has what is called a due diligence obligation under international law. A due diligence obligation states that a state that is aware that harmful operations, and I mean significantly harmful, not minor stuff, but significantly harmful operations are emanating from their territory, have a legal obligation to put an end to those operations, whether those operations be mounted by another state or by non-state actors. If the territorial state breaches this obligation, fails to comply with the obligation of due diligence, then that state has violated international law. The state is not responsible for the operations. The state is responsible for its breach of its obligation to, if you will, ensure its territory is not used for acts against another state. Which means that now, in your hypothetical, China, in mine state B, which
Mine's
means,
not hypothetical.
Which means that, okay, which means that now this opens the door to countermeasures against China, to compel China to get them to knock it off. Now,
Dun, dun, dun.
yeah, but I should hasten to add, you know, you got a 600+ page book on your lap. It's not quite that easy as a matter of law. There are lots and lots of steps you go through. You should normally place them on notice. The countermeasure must be proportionate. I could go on and on and on and on.
Megan, anything quick, and then if you can get the mic here for David in the front, and then David will close us out.
So I'll play the lawyer. Can you, anything quick on which aspect?
I mean, so it was a question about Sony and North Korea and 3 things that we might have done back. I mean, how can you give us a sense of how those conversations happen inside the sit room? I mean, can you give us any oomph? No, you can't. Okay.
Well,
David Edelman, ladies and gentlemen.
I think, first of all, it's important to note, obviously, it's stating the obvious, but I think in some countries it may not be the case. There is a conversation about this. There isn't just an immediate reaction.
Yeah.
And that, I would argue, is a state's obligation under international law to assess what's happened to it to the extent that it can, undertake an attribution analysis, which we haven't talked about, but I think it would be useful for the group to understand the way the book comes out on attribution. And then how does this work out? Essentially, there's a question that's put to the interagency, which is, give us a set of options here, and a timeline, some of which are usually ridiculously unreasonable, but in this case, one has to act quickly. In most cases, I think many folks feel that the reaction was not quick enough, both in the case of Sony as well as the DNC space. But a list of options are presented and discussed, and that's the role of the National Security Council, is to give the leadership options, and ultimately the policy call is for the president to make.
Okay. David, last comment.
Answer the attribution question.
I mean, we've got last 5 minutes. We've got last 5 minutes. So.
Hi, David Edelman. I had Megan's old job at the NSC in what feels like the Jurassic era. A question for all of you. I'm wondering, Professor Schmidt in particular, but if you could help us go from the gray area to the flashpoint, sort of taking your invitation of beyond Tallinn 2.0. If you're having a conversation with states, indeed the conversation that you did have with states, what are those areas in which the international legal community has the greatest coalescence and which states are most likely to disagree? In other words, where there's pretty clear consensus about what the law says, and yet if you go and brief around the world to various governments, where do you anticipate those 2 or 3 areas in which the governments will find those conclusions to be most uncomfortable or most at odds with what their plans are right now?
Well, there are 2, because thanks to our friends, the Dutch, we had the opportunity to speak robustly with states in a really non-attribution environment and so forth. The 2, I would say, well, maybe I'll add 3. The first one is due diligence, the principle that I've just mentioned. Because some states, wrongly and confusedly, pushed back on due diligence. I'm looking at my friend Gary Korn, the SJ of Cybercom here. Wrongly pushed back on due diligence because what they said is, holy cow, you're making me shoulder this incredible burden. Do you know how many hostile operations are mounted from the territory of State X? We gave him a glass of water. It was a glass of calm down, okay? Because we told them that under international law, the obligation is only one of feasibility. And that's generally the obligation of international law. You don't have to do everything you can. You have to do what's feasible and reasonable in the circumstances. And with respect to the United States, and I'm not highlighting the United States, but I happen to believe that the United States does in fact do that. If there are hostile operations hurting other states, I believe we take action. There are people that know better than me, but I believe that. The second reason that I said you need to embrace the notion of due diligence is because countermeasures are not available to actions taken by non-state actors. They're actions against states, for states breaching their obligation. So holy cow, does that mean that if I get a non-state actor attack, operation against me, all I can do is lock them up? The answer is no, because in the China example, the other state is in breach of a due diligence obligation. You may respond to the breach of the due diligence obligation, and if you remember the question from Greg, I can respond and it doesn't have to be in kind. So how do I do that? I target the non-state actors. And I'm doing that, I'm breaching the sovereignty of that state to shoot back at them. But due diligence raised some eyebrows. Recently, the question of sovereignty has come up. It did not come up much at all that I can remember, but much during our deliberations with states, but it subsequently surfaced. And there is a view that's being floated by serious players that says that sovereignty is in fact a foundational principle. I mean, it's the Peace of Westphalia. Come on, it's the principle. It's the mother of all principles. Sovereignty. But it isn't a rule. You don't breach sovereignty. You don't break the rule. You look to sovereignty as the source of these others. I'm concerned that's something that no member of the international group of experts agreed with, and I haven't heard it much, but recently it's gotten some traction, and I'm a little bit nervous about that. And then there's there was a view on the part of states that said, listen, if you're going to pin the rose on us, attribution, you have to produce the evidence. Show us. Before you allege, show us. To which I believe that may be good policy, that may be wise, it may make you ethical, but it sure as heck is not an obligation of international law. You may choose to reveal your evidence or not choose to reveal your evidence. If you find yourself before an international tribunal or an arbitral panel, they will have rules of evidence that will apply, but just on a day-to-day. And then just quickly, since it's attribution, Megan's excellent point, attribution. What's the standard of attribution? If you find yourself before a tribunal, before an arbitral panel, the tribunal or arbitral panel will impose its own rules. If you find yourself in a criminal court, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. If you find yourself in a civil suit, it's preponderance of the evidence, okay? In international law, tribunals have their own standards in that fashion as well. But if you're not before a court, then the rule is that states must act as reasonable states do in same or similar circumstances. For the lawyers in the audience, that's the old tort law rule. Act reasonably. However, there is one exception the majority of the group of experts felt, and it's an important one. We have talked tonight about countermeasures over and over and over. The international group of experts, the majority of them took the position that with respect to countermeasures, remember, unlawful act responding to an unlawful act, you got to get it right. If you get attribution wrong and you respond, then you are responsible for that international wrongful act. Lawyers would say there has been no preclusion of the wrongfulness of that activity.
And it struck me, I heard a discussion by renowned scholars one time, and they were arguing about how much attribution is enough. And what it reminded me all through what you were saying is, it depends what you want to do. You know,
it
the
depends
amount
on what
of
the
attribution
circumstances
depends
are.
on, right.
It depends on how severe. I mean, if we're talking about a minor incident, well, you probably got to get the attribution almost 100% correct because the consequences are low. But if you're taking extraordinary, something extraordinary is happening to you, then you can operate with less certainty. Why? Because you're taking hits. That's reasonable.
And the more attribution you have, the more precise your attribution can be, the more policy options it unlocks for those policymakers. Okay, concluding remarks. We're a touch over time. My apologies for keeping us a little bit over, and for those that had questions, I know I recognize some of you and I didn't get to you, and so my apologies as moderator for that. But any final comments, Megan and Rutger? And maybe Rutger, if you can also talk maybe just what else the Netherlands has plans. I know you've got quite a bit.
Well, I mean, I talked about the need to reach common understandings. So, I mean, the main reason that we launched the Hague process was to promote dialogue. I mean, to my knowledge, this was really the first time that we had this type of discussion at this level of detail. Again, it's not intended to replace other ongoing negotiations or to forego those conclusions, but it is valuable in and of itself to have this conversation, and you know, we're hoping to continue that. We have a number of events planned. We're taking the show on the road to The Hague, to Canberra, to Tallinn, and a number of other countries. The type of courses that the CCDCOE offers on international law, we intend to copy those and offer them to other parts of the world. And you know, hopefully, if we do have the chance, we hope to continue the consultation meetings now that the manual is out. I mean, as has been pointed out, it doesn't provide all the answers. In fact, you know, this
Actually,
is not,
it does.
This is not.
It clearly hasn't read it. Yeah.
Well, some might see it not as the end of the conversation, but as the start of the conversation. And,
A diplomat.
Yeah.
I think that would be valuable to have. If we can play a role in that, we'll certainly do so. But I'd just like to thank Mike for all his work.
And thanks to the Kingdom of the Netherlands for all your support as part of the process. Megan, any last comments?
Just that, as I started to say in the beginning, I think that one of the best things that this manual does is it provides an opportunity for conversation, and in some ways, although the diplomats in the room may want to hang me for this, in some ways that's a confidence building measure. So the opportunity to have some dialogue about action in this space that, you know, 10 years ago nobody was really willing to talk about, for fear that we might give the other guys some ideas or something like that. I think, you know, going on the road, I think, is a great opportunity, and hopefully the dialogue can continue.
Great. I want to point out two upcoming events. One, the Cyber 912 Student Challenge from the Atlantic Council. We're going to be holding it 17 and 18 March at American University, and Eric Novotny I see here in the audience. This is the students coming together, university students, saying there's a large-scale cyber incident going on. What should our response be? Mr. President, no one's died yet. It's too early for NATO Article 5, but let's consider Article 4, sanctions and indictments. And so I'm sure that they're going to be using this manual and the things in it as they think about what those responses should be. We'd love to have people here come to be observers on that, and as judges. We have 48 teams this year. So almost 200 students are going to be coming together and working their way through, and as well as Air Force Academy, Military Academy, and Naval Academy. And so we'll have our many commanders-in-chief. And also, of course, SciCon this year in Tallinn. And so I hope to see you all out in Tallinn this year for SciCon. Please give our thanks to the panelists.